Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. From the G7 to GM, there is trouble for the investor class, not only of the United States, but globally. GM is ahead of us. We will discuss the problems there suddenly emerging in announcements about the pre-bankruptcy GM either misleading or ignoring problems in smaller cars. This is earlier in this century. G7, within these hours, the leaders of the G7, that's an old-fashioned organization that included Japan, mostly made up of European and U.S. and Canadian entries. These were the large industrial nations during the later Cold War, facing up against the Warsaw Pact, against Russia. And then at some point, as Russia went through the transformation from the clumsy Soviet ideology into a modern state, an energy superpower, Russia was invited into the G8. Well, today, Russia was either disinvited or told to come back later when it's cleaned up the Crimean story, or in some event asked to leave. And the G7 now has chosen Brussels for the meeting that was originally scheduled for Sochi, where the Olympics were, Brussels in June. The larger story, of course, is this is not the Cold War. However, it is a disagreement, a profound disagreement between a major European power, Russia, and the United States of America. In between are the European states, Germany, France, and England certainly dominating the story, but all the rest of the EU 28 nations are in between. This will not be settled quickly. This is not something that the American people have had occasion to hear about these last years. I grew up in the Cold War. I remember it vividly. There was always a moment in the Cold War when you had to worry about your money over the weekend. And I welcome my colleague and co-host, Thaddeus McCotter at WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes, because Detroit is both G7 and G8. Thaddeus, you're a younger person, but you can recall the Cold War. You lived in Detroit during the Cold War. You can recall that there were moments that there were major confrontations, especially towards the close during the Reagan years. Do you remember people talking of fear of the Cold War, of anxiety? How do you recall it, Thaddeus? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Well, as a member of Generation X, we largely remember the start, our cognizance of the Cold War started with the SALT treaties, with Nixon, and then it wound up with Reagan and Gorbachev.
Right.
So you saw the tail end. We didn't see the fear and the panic that surrounded crises such as the Berlin crisis with the wall coming up, or with the Cuban Missile Crisis. We weren't there for that, or with Hungary. And some of us were, like 3 years old when Czechoslovakia was put down in 1968. So largely we saw it moving from an adversarial nuclear threat to a potential ally down the road under Reagan, Gorbachev, and when the wall came down.
That was a good course. It led to what looked to be comedy in the late 20th century. Well, comedy's gone. We welcome Aaron Task, the editor-in-chief of Yahoo Finance and the host of the Daily Ticker. Aaron, in the market today, the headlines are that people are taking profits. There was a good run for some stocks, Netflix, for example, last year, and it's wise to always take profits. Why are they taking profits, Aaron? Was there buzz about the G7 grumpiness today? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Yeah, there was definitely some chatter about the G7 and the fact that the situation in Ukraine remains unstable, and there were reports over the weekend of the Russians amassing troops along the eastern border. Will Putin try to annex more of Ukraine? I think that's a threat that's out there for sure. There was also more bad data out of China. Their manufacturing index fell to its lowest level in several years. And there's still the hangover from last week's Fed meeting, and altogether, people are looking at some of the high-flying stocks that have had huge moves. You mentioned Netflix,
right?
And they're saying, maybe it's not such a terrible idea to take some profits here. And as you know, when that starts to happen, and it's a momentum stock, things can happen very quickly. And momentum is a double-edged sword. and now you're seeing the momentum on the other side.
Aaron, just the fun detail before I turn you over to Thaddeus. We have late news that the Brooklyn Nets, owned by a Russian oligarch, are to be repatriated to Russia. Now, the NBA hasn't said exactly what that means, but I can guess it means that the business of owning the Nets, which is now a U.S.-based business, is going to move back to Moscow, and the owner of the Nets says that he's doing this in response to a call from Vladimir Putin to repatriate all Russian businesses to come home to combat the sanctions leveled by the Americans. Now, that's only a smile, and I'm sure that there will be some chuckles at NBA games tonight. But, Aaron, isn't it true that a lot of traders live in Brooklyn and probably are attending Nets games right now?
Well, it is true, and it's a fascinating story, and I got to believe that Prohorov, I believe is how you pronounce his name, he must be doing something right in Vladimir Putin's eyes, because he ran for president against Putin, and he's still able to walk around and control his billions. He wasn't thrown in a Siberian jail or a gulag. So,
right.
He's playing the game. He's playing both sides. I do wonder how the NBA will respond, if this will affect his ability to control the Nets. But yes, a lot of folks who work on Wall Street, a lot of more financial journalists who cover Wall Street live in Brooklyn, so I wonder what impact this will have on the Nets.
The Mikhail Prokhorov is his name, and the Nets are going home to Moscow. We don't know if they're going to rename them. We haven't got that far yet, the Moscow Nets. Thaddeus, you have a question for Aaron.
They could call them the Brooklyn Nets.
Yes, very good, Natty. I like that, Thaddeus. We recommend that. That's offered to Prokhorov for free, the Brooklyn Nets. Go ahead, Thaddeus.
Hey, Aaron, when you talked earlier, you said that Communist China had a slowdown in its manufacturing. Many of us, myself included, have considered them almost a mercantilist, export-driven economy. To what do they attribute the slowdown in their manufacturing, and what is the state of their domestic consumption?
Well, it's a great question, and their domestic consumption hasn't risen as fast as necessary to offset the slowdown in global demand. I mean, their biggest trading partner is Europe, and Europe has been mired in a horrible recession that they've only just recently emerged from. So I think it's fair to say that the Chinese data, you can take it with a grain of salt, and I think last year they were fudging some of the numbers to get to the 7+% growth rate, which itself is a slowdown from 10% a few years ago. And now it's getting harder for them to hide how much less business they're doing, particularly with Europe. And it's affecting their economy broadly, which is affecting demand for commodities around the world. A lot of the traders will look at what's gone on in the price of copper, which has plummeted in recent months, and I think it's mainly because of less demand out of China. And so their export economy has cooled more than their consumption economy has heated up to compensate for that.
General Motors, GM's got problems, Aaron, and the stock has staggered sideways these last days. Speaking to journalists following General Motors very carefully, the plaintiff's court is serious business about these allegations that small GM cars had troubles, chiefly the ignition turned off when you're going 60 miles per hour. This is in the Chevy Cobalt. Other cars had problems before the bankruptcy. And those problems were either covered up or not dealt with effectively. There were deaths. There were lots of injuries. On the street, that's the question. The J.P. Morgan analyst says not a problem, a minimum thing. But Mary Barra, the new CEO, is apologizing. What does the street say? They haven't taken big pieces out of General Motors, but they can.
No, they really have been, surprisingly so. I mean, I think the street looks at it and says, this is a company that went through bankruptcy, and the problems are with the quote-unquote old GM and not the new GM, so that the new GM will be protected in the bankruptcy courts. But obviously, in the court of public opinion, they're taking a beating. I think it's certainly going to hurt them reputationally. When you look at the big settlement that Toyota just made with the DOJ, it's possible that GM could be looking at a fine somewhere, in the high $100 millions, possibly $1 billion, and that's serious money even for GM. So there's serious risk out there for the company, and there's all kinds of claims coming out that they knew about this for even longer than they've said now, that there are other defects that they knew about that they've tried to hide. So it's a huge public relations problem for sure, But to your point right now, the street is saying it's nothing more than that. The risk is that it does become something more than that.
Thaddeus, General Motors, is it regarded as part of the recovery, if there is to be one, for Detroit and Michigan, or is that old talk? Am I being sentimental and General Motors is just another company? Get in line.
No, the auto industry and the supply chain, manufacturing, still very important to Michigan, and it's something that's going on with GM that's going to affect everyone in this area, either directly or indirectly. And I must say that I think that a lot of people are taking great confidence in the way Mary Barra is trying to handle this.
Mary Barra is the CEO of General Motors, named the middle of January this year. She's risen through the ranks. She's a lifer at General Motors, and right now she's apologized for what we know of these faults, and she's taken a very large charge, but plaintiffs' attorneys are hungry. Thaddeus McCotter is WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes, and we thank Aaron Task, the editor-in-chief of Yahoo Finance. I'm John Batchelor.